Report on a journey to the western states of North America and a stay of several years along the Missouri during the years 1824 to 1827 by Gottfried Duden. 20th letter, part 2, written in June 1826. Number 30. One will then discover what interests clashed there in those times and realize that even centuries ago there were dissatisfied persons in all classes of society ready to exchange their own country for America. It was not merely a struggle between the rich and the poor, the freemen and the slaves, the cultured and the uneducated, the enlightened and the fanatics which agitated the human race. It was a period when, besides physical interests in material goods, which are always present as long as men have mortal bodies, in most of the European countries, human nature began to focus upon itself instead of depending solely on individual impressions, as was the case formerly. The mind of men began to be conscious of itself, to sense itself as a constant under all conditions, and based upon this created a demand for independence from the entire outer world, and especially from other men and their opinions and actions. However, in all stages of development, the relation of man to the Supreme Being represents, among all other relationships, the primary one. Therefore, here too, it had to be the mind's first object of more careful consideration when examining its environment with a freer vision. For each person, the history of his own development will furnish the commentary for this thesis. What is more explicable than as soon as insurgence of intellectual life occurred anywhere in Europe, a struggle with hierarchical limitations followed as the initial consequence. This struggle also had to consume one's vital energy for a considerable time, although not exclusively, but yet chiefly, partly because the mind was fully occupied with the ideas in question, and partly because external restrictions could not be removed so quickly. Only later could the investigating thinkers gradually succeed in mastering the significance of the other relationships, so that an influence on volition and action became possible, an influence that not only agitated against religious and political pressure, but also instigated an unremitting struggle for general independence. The history of England presents no exception. Because the entire population of Great Britain took part in this development, all classes were affected by the interests connected with it. To the interests and material possessions were added religious interests and overwhelming strength. Later, religious interests were crowded more and more into the background by political ones. How can one be surprised that during a time when all of Great Britain was embroiled in religious feuding, the masses of people emigrating to America were not unbiased? As little as the struggles in the mother country stopped with the emigrations, just as little could the colonists be expected to remain free from them. Bulow assumes that when the various religious sects were developing in England, only fanaticism and prejudice prevailed on one side, and on the other side quiet circumspection and reason. He does not expressly say that, but it is the basis of his deductions. Nothing can be more erroneous. The sky was dark in England as well as in the rest of Europe. Whoever defended old traditions obstinately was as unclear in his thinking as those who attacked them fanatically. Where insight is lacking, it cannot rule. The times were ruled by base impulses even more than now, and they alone attained their purpose, to which every fighter contributed without knowing it. Therefore, it is a serious mistake to speak of immigrating Puritans, Presbyterians, and so forth, in order to draw conclusions about the characteristics of present-day Americans. Nothing in particular can be deduced from that, even if one could assume that only these sects emigrated. They, as well as those who remained in Europe, possessed the seeds for further development. But such an assumption contradicts historical facts. All the main interests that had influenced the English, the Scotch, and the Irish to action since the first discovery of the Atlantic continent also had an effect on the emigrations. Those who have prevailed to the present, I repeat, without active commercial and political intercourse, have been able to maintain the intellectual development of the North Americans at the same level as that of Great Britain. Finally, if one mentions the criminals sent to the United States, one should consider whether their number was ever as significant in comparison to that of good colonists as the rabble, sentenced or not sentenced, that remained behind was and still is in comparison to the respectable inhabitants of these countries. These remarks hold true for all states of the Union. The history of the population of older states is approximately the same. One cannot speak of characteristics peculiar to individual states, at least not essential ones, no matter what may be said on this subject. In newer states it does not come into question because of uniform immigrations from all Atlantic states. In Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee, in Indiana, in Illinois and Missouri, and in the rest of the western states, the immigrants from Pennsylvania and New York live beside those from Virginia, Maryland, and Carolina. I have already made an exception of the state of Louisiana, where, up to the present, the French population has predominated. Almost all of the few Spanish families that had settled on the Mississippi departed as soon as their king was no longer the supreme ruler. Even the difference between states where slavery is permitted and those where laws forbid it is not yet so striking. The reason is, even in the latter states, there are many Negroes and mulattoes who, while they are free, almost all serve as day laborers, servants, and maids, and because of the general prejudice against their dark skins, have scarcely better relationships with their employers than real slaves. Derisive nicknames that the individual provinces give to each other are hardly worth mentioning. They have no more significance than similar chaffing in other countries. One often hears the expression here, "He is a Yankee." This name is given to the inhabitants of New England. The name is derived from the Yanco Indians in Rhode Island, and New Englanders are said to have assumed it themselves at first as a kind of joke. Now it has the connotation of the craftiness and business of which the inhabitants of other states accuse New Englanders. Warden, in his account of the United States of America, derives the name Yankee from the Cherokee word Kankee, meaning cowardly or servile. Southern tribes applied it to the New Englanders because they had refused them their assistance in a war against the Cherokees. He bases this statement on Anbury's journeys. Only after such a historical introduction may we proceed to the study of the present. Without it, life in America, as it is now, can be neither properly comprehended nor evaluated. Just as only the person who connects it with it a knowledge of the characteristics of the new land itself is completely prepared, it is equally true that the proper use of historical data must in itself prevent many misconceptions now prevalent in Germany. How absurd, for instance, seems the assumption that in religious matters the United States lags behind Europe, when as long as a half-century ago its people had, by way of freedom of thought concerning human nature, progressed to the point of decisive political struggles. The general law that no one needs to account for his religious opinions is as old as the Union itself. In the charters of the constitutions of individual states, we read that only those who are confessors of Christianity can hold office. In others, everyone who believes in a supreme being. Who can still speak of traces of puritanical persecution in the light of such results brought about by the votes of the entire citizenry? What would the present-day inhabitants of Germany and Switzerland say if one were to judge them by the frenzy of olden times, which incited even the reformer Calvin to the murder of Servetus, or by the burning of witches, which occurred as late as the middle of the past century? On the contrary, there would be more basis for the assertion that this highly regarded toleration approaches a certain indifference toward religion and cult. But this criticism is just as warranted with regard to European Christianity. In Europe, one believes that when the future is threatened by the action of inner forces, it can be met by outer force. In America, on the other hand, one puts trust in these inner forces themselves and seeks comfort in the thought that a people living in a situation such as that in the United States will not soon turn away completely from the eternal voice of truth, and that the essentials of Christianity must be preserved beneath all outward forms. They regard any coercion in a cult as an interference in the relationship of the individual to the Supreme Being, and fear more harm from it than any fanatical aberration could cause to the existing freedom of religion. It is foolish to think that such aberrations would gain the approval of the majority of the people. Public opinion tolerates a sect's troublemaking here as little as in Germany. However, they are convinced that forms of coercion against them are worse than the evil itself. One can only say to the person who judges prematurely the condition of the whole on the basis of individual details that he should consider what would probably happen if the masses of the European countries were suddenly left to their own devices, as the North Americans actually are. That Americans are not entirely indifferent to cults is proved, among other things, by the conformity in the laws of all states regarding the observance of Sunday, which shows just as clearly how well in North America freedom of religion is distinguished from license. As far as I know, only in Louisiana, where French customs prevail, is an exception. In the other states, the lawmakers were unanimously of the opinion that noisy pleasures were least fitting for Sunday. To hunt on Sundays is also punishable by law. Whoever believes, however, that they have gone too far in some respects, for instance that not all music but only dance music should have been forbidden, does not consider the nature of democratic procedures, which does not permit such distinctions. Aside from a rather large number of Jews, all inhabitants of the United States confess to be Christians, but in very different ways. For example, in my neighborhood there are Lutherans, Catholics, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists, Baptists, and Swedenborgians. Where there is no building for church services, private homes are open during the hours of worship, and where there is no local pastor, itinerant ministers appear from time to time. This depends, of course, very much on the population. Moreover, these religious differences never cause any friction in social intercourse. From what I have written up to this point, one could still be inclined to think of the North Americans simply as Englishmen in America. But this would be far from the truth and coincide merely with the superficial outlines of the picture. To be sure, I would not know how to formulate the basis of my description better than by the advice to think of the North Americans for the time being as Englishmen in America. But one should make note of the expression "for the time being," and beware of keeping too closely to this idea so that one does not dream of an England in America. Everyone knows that in America there is no noble class, no personal rank at all, and this alone distinguishes it significantly enough from Britain, as well as from the rest of Europe. But the fact is not so well known in Germany that in North America no distinction at all is made between city dwellers and country people, and yet no characteristic of local life strikes a European more than this. To consider the American farmer in the same light as the German peasant would be a great mistake. In dress and in manners, country people and city dwellers are completely alike, and peasant women in the German sense are seen nowhere. All trades have the same status, and the new order of society has overcome the seemingly unconquerable old world prejudices of the Europeans. Only in harbor cities does one notice that European ideas have some influence. But everywhere, farming is a respected occupation, and the highest official of the state would not hesitate to do manual labor on his own farm.